Okay, so today we are going to talk about a few more examples of DockerCompose, how to use a DockerCompose with few more examples. So I am opening one application in my VS Code. Okay, this is one application. It has got mainly two components in that application. One is the backend and another one is the front end. Okay, so let's talk about the backend now. So this backend is one application. This is the code of that application. Okay, we don't need to understand the code, by the way. We just need to understand what are the different components of this application and how can we create a compose file to deploy that application in our containers. That is only our goal. Okay, so I'm just telling you like what this application is. This application is one backend and one front end. So the front end is going to give the calls to the backend component of the application. So this is the backend component which has got few API endpoints provided. Okay, so here it is. So this is one API endpoint / goals. Okay, what this code does and all that we don't need to understand. Okay, that's not our lookout as a DevOps person. This is what the developer has created, this application. We just need to understand how this backend communicates with the front end. That is the only the point we need to understand as a DevOps person. But just to give a basic understanding, this backend exposes few endpoints like goals, and another here also there is an endpoint. So this is a post request, this is a get request / goals, and this is a post / goals. Right, these are the two main endpoints here. Another is delete. So if we want to delete any goal, then this is how the endpoint is / goals, and then we have to provide the ID of the goal which we want to delete. Simple as that. So there is a code to connect to the MongoDB database. So there is a database called MongoDB. So basically this backend stores the data into a database called MongoDB. Okay, so in this particular application we have got mainly three components. One is front end, back end, second, and third is MongoDB database. So this is the MongoDB database. We can see this is how the connection string is created. So there is an environment variable called MongoDB username. Okay, and MongoDB password. Here it is MongoDB password, and then this is the name MongoDB :27017. So this entire thing is called as connection string. This one. Okay, so MongoDB : // this is the protocol. The way we have HTTP protocol, here we have a protocol named MongoDB : // then we have the username for that database which the application is reading from the environment variable MongoDB _username : password for that MongoDB database, again it is reading it from the environment variable MongoDB _password. Then there is an @ and the name of the machine where this MongoDB is present, MongoDB, the name, : 27017 is the port on which this MongoDB database is available for the connection. Okay, this is how it has been connected. Now all these things we need to know before we create a deployment file, a compose file for this application. Okay, that is why I am just taking you through this code. We don't need to understand the logic of this application. What we only need to understand as a DevOps engineer is like how these three, as I said, how these three components communicate with each other. So here what is the point of our interest is how this backend is communicating with the MongoDB database. So it is connecting to that MongoDB database by reading few environment variables, and these environment variables is something we need to set while creating the compose file for this application. That is why we need to understand these things. Otherwise we don't need to understand. Yeah, one more point. So this particular application, the backend one, listens to port 80. So inside the container, this application's backend listens to port 80. So these are only 2-3 things for us as a DevOps engineer are interesting or something we need to know. These are those things. So there is a folder called env again here. So this env folder has got backend.env. So as I just told you, that inside that backend code, so that backend code connects to the MongoDB using 2 environment variables. So those 2 environment variables are set in a file called backend.env. So this backend folder contains the backend application source code. Then this env folder contains the environment file one for backend environment, right? So this has got 2 environment variables, MongoDB underscore username and MongoDB underscore password, right? And then there is a front end in the sense UI. So every application has got 2 things basically. One is the front end UI side and another one is the back end, that is a logic side, business logic side. So we just had gone through this back end side just now. From there we just understood few points which are of interest for us as a DevOps person, right? Now let's understand about front end. So this front end has got again a code. So we don't need to understand this entire code. That's not our main purpose. Forget about the entire code. What we need to understand is how does it connect to the backend code is what is of our interest, right? So let's scroll up a bit and we will understand if there is anything which is of our interest here as a DevOps person. So here it localhost/goals. So it connects to it using a localhost, the backend. See here, localhost again /goals. So using a localhost is it basically connects to the backend, right? And then there is this absolutely fine. Okay, this is what the front end is. So front end communicates with the backend using http://localhost. That's it. Okay, that is of our interest only here. And now we are going to create a compose file to deploy this application. So how many components are there in our application? 3. One is backend, front end, second and third is MongoDB, that is database. So let's open this. This is our compose file. So in this compose file we have got the first service, the way we had created the services in our previous sessions, right? There we had created 2 services, one is Nexus, another one is Jenkins. Here we have got 3 services, one is MongoDB, second front end, third backend. So services. So we are giving a name to a service MongoDB, Then for this MongoDB, we are defining which image we want to use. So we want to use a Mongo image, and we want to mount the volume. So we can see here volumes, and we want to mount a /data/db. This is where the inside the container MongoDB creates the data. Okay, we can check their official website, MongoDB Docker Hub. See, this is their official website, official web page, a Mongo, a database, and this is their official web page of this Mongo image, Docker image. And if you just scroll down, you will see the details about the mount and all. So let's scroll down, and we can check here where does it keep the data. Yeah, this is fine. And environment variables is fine. Init database, Docker secrets, that's fine. I'm just checking the details about the store data. Where to store data? Here it is. You see /data/db is where the MongoDB stores the data inside the container. So if you want to mount it, right, if you want to mount it, you can mount this directory to any directory of your choice. So we are creating a named volume here, and then environment variables, right? Environment variables. So instead of setting the environment variables here, what we have done is we have set those environment variables in this mongo.env. So see here, this is a mongo.env where we have a mongo initdb root username environment variable. So this is the username for the root user of that database. This is the password of that user. These two environment variables we are taking from our mongo env file. So instead of defining them here, we are setting those environment variables here inside this file, right? Then the next service is backend. So the next service is what? Our backend service. Inside our backend service, we will talk about this build a little later once we will understand a Docker file concept, which we have not yet started with. We will understand this later, but other things which are of interest here is ports. As we had seen in this backend app.js, our application runs inside the container. It runs on port 80. You see here app.listen. So this app.listen starts that particular application on port 80. So this backend listens to port 80 inside the container. Okay, so if we see here, if we want to do a port mapping, this is our internal port, which is 80, a container port 80 where that application listens for connections, and this is the external port. This is where you want to forward the port 80, correct? Then we have got few volumes and the environment variables backend env. So these are the environment variables. MongoDB username, MongoDB password, these are the environment variables this backend application uses here. You see here MongoDB username, it is reading it from environment. This is also reading it from environment password, and we are setting these environment variables using backend env. The way we have the environment variables created in Mongo env for Mongo container. Similarly, for backend, we have the environment variables defined in backend.env, and this is what we have defined here in this compose file. Now, what this depends on, this is interesting point. We have not seen this yet, but what is the interesting point is, and why do we need it here is, when we will run the DockerCompose, right? We have already seen like how to start the containers. So we start using DockerCompose, and then we provide the path of the YAML file. So docker-compose.yaml space up. This is how we start the containers, right? Now the point is, as soon as we run this command, it starts creating the containers. Now what this tells is, this depends on, what this tells is, this tells the DockerCompose to create this container first, this MongoDB, before it goes for the creation of this backend. Why? Because this backend needs to connect to MongoDB. Do you see here in this code, a backend is connecting to the MongoDB. So unless you have your MongoDB container up and running, there is no point in going ahead with the backend container creation, because backend container needs the MongoDB container. Okay, so there is a dependency that MongoDB should be created before the backend. This is the dependency, and that dependency we are telling with the help of this depends on. So when we will create the containers with DockerCompose up, DockerCompose will make sure that this MongoDB is up and running, and once it is done, then only it will go ahead with the backend container. Then this front end one. Let's talk about the front end now. Forget about a build for now, but the ports. Now if you go and check the front end here, and inside the front end, this is our application, and this front end application listens to port 3000, which is the default port. It is not mentioned anywhere here, but this is the default port for any React or Angular application. Now this kind of information you will get it from the developer. You don't need to know it as a DevOps person. You don't need to know all these things. You can just ask your developer, okay, which port, if I start this application, so which port it listens for the connection, which port it listens to. So the developer will give you this information. So it is not expected that the DevOps person should know this. You can ask it to your concerned developer and he will give you this answer. And you need to just simply map the ports accordingly. 3000 is the internal port, and this 3000 is the external port. Then volumes again, and this stdin open is I'll show you once we will create the compose node. We will talk about this. And again you can see this depends upon backend. So the order would be, once we will start this DockerCompose up, order would be like this. First MongoDB container would be created, MongoDB server would be started. Once it is up and running, then backend would be created, backend would be started, and at the end, front end container would be created and it would be started. So this is how the dependency has been managed. Otherwise what will happen is, like, if we don't mention this depends on, no, here as well as here we have a depends on here, right? So if we don't mention these things, what happens is DockerCompose up, as soon as you do know, it starts creating all the containers parallelly, and then there would be problem. If the MongoDB is not up and running, your backend will not be able to start up. If your backend is not running, your front end will also face the issues in getting started up. So these are the dependencies, right? So we need to manage those dependencies with the help of depends on. And there are volumes. You can see data is one volume which we have used here for MongoDB. You can see this is the volume where we are storing a data from this location, and there is another volume called logs, and this is the logs we are using it for. So for preserving our applications logs. Okay, what these are kind of these are again the volumes, but these are different types of volumes. We will talk about them, but not now. Let's understand the deployment of this application first, and then we will talk about this other type of volume. If you guys remember, I had mentioned that there are mainly two types of volumes. One is the named volumes and another one is bind volumes, bind mounts. So far whatever the volumes we had seen and talked about, they are they are named volumes. These are those data, logs, as well as the data. Here for MongoDB there is a volume data. So these are named volumes. We will talk about the bind mounts, but little later, not now. Okay, so this is the understanding of this application's Docker file. Now we will start the container. So let's go inside this CMD and let's say Docker Compose up. Now you don't need to provide the path of the file. If you guys remember, when we had seen this Docker Compose up, so we used to send the name of a file like this. But if your name of the file is this one, docker-compose.yaml is the name of your file, then you don't need to send the file name explicitly. If you check our previous example, I will just take you there just for understanding purpose. The name of our file was this one, start Jenkins and Nexus YAML. So if you have your Docker Compose file's name other than this docker-compose.yaml, okay, if the name of your YAML is other than this, then you have to specify the name. Otherwise you can skip this. You can provide this name or skip this as well. Okay, because when you run this Docker Compose up, by default Docker Compose looks for the file with the name docker-compose.yaml in the current directory. But if your Docker Compose name is something different than the docker-compose YAML, then you can provide the name. If the location is also different, then you have to provide the -f. Otherwise you can skip this. But let's define this for the sake of simplicity. And it's good practice like to provide this name of a file. There is no harm in it. So let me go to that. So this is my file, and I am starting my Docker Compose. So you can see it is first creating, and it has not yet started creating other containers. Why this is so? Because of that depends on. If I remove that depends on from here, no, so there it doesn't follow any order. It starts creating the containers parallelly. MongoDB, front end, back end, it will start creating all of those, right? But as now we have the dependency there, so we are mentioning we have mentioned basically the depends on, and hence it is first creating, see here, it is pulling the image, MongoDB image, it is pulling. Once the MongoDB container is created and it is up and running, then it will start the other ones. Right, so now it has moved on to backend, and now soon it will create the front end one. Right, soon. Let's wait for a minute. It is creating a Docker image actually, which we would be talking about now. Right now, let's concentrate only on the deployment part. Then we are going to see the Docker file creation part soon. But let it create the Docker image. It is currently creating a Docker image. It is taking a bit of time, but okay, let it do whatever it is doing, and then once it is done, by the time it is creating the Docker image, let's check this MongoDB. So this MongoDB is already up and running. We can check that Docker container ps -a. So let me check. Okay, there is nothing as of now. DockerCompose. Docker container. Yes. Okay, the containers are not yet started. Okay, it is still building the image. Let me remove the unwanted containers. Docker container stop. I'm not using these containers anymore now. This Jenkins, Nexus. So I'm removing these ABD, ABC1, ABC, all these containers. Container and PS. So there is nothing. Okay, let it run the steps. Actually it is creating the Docker image, that's why it is taking so long, which we have not yet talked about. So that's why I'm not explaining you anything here, what it is doing and all, which we are now going to talk about soon. But that is what it is doing actually. Yes, so it is correct. Now it is about to complete the Docker image creation. Yes, it has created the Docker image. Correct. And now it has given me one error about the port 8080. That's fine. Okay. Now there is some service running on my machine's port 8080. That's why it has given me the error. Okay, never mind. So what we will do is, let me do DockerCompose down, and I will just change the port. So problem is, here my external port 8080 on my system, I am having something running on that port, right? So that's why it has given me the error. So let me just do it 5, and let's run the DockerCompose again. Correct. So it has started the container, and if we check, see here, there are 3 containers running. One is here. Let's see, these are the container IDs, right? This one is the front end container. You can check. This is the front end container. This is a back end container, and this is a MongoDB. So there are 3 containers running. Okay, and 3 of them, they are part of my application. Okay, so they are part of my application. Now let's go to browser, and let's check if we can access front end. Yeah, this is the front end application. Right, I am adding few things here, but this is the front end application. So this is front end. So front end is actually communicating with the back end, and then back end is communicating with my actually database. That is how it is working.